A very warm welcome to my community. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have joined us. A special thanks to Sir David Seal and the folks of the People's Market who continue to make the production of this series possible. Thank you. It is one of those communities here on our island that has nurtured the mind, fed the body, the spirit, and has made souls to shine. In fact, it stood out like a flower in the field, truly a rose of Sharon for centuries. The community of Sharon here in St. Thomas has been synonymous with the Moravian Church that took on its name centuries ago. The fruit of its labor are today seen across this island and beyond our shores. While my community focuses on the history of the 20th century, there comes a time when stepping back further becomes important in order for us to truly understand life, as it were, in the 20th century. Historian Hal Eiffel does just that for us as he begins My Community, Sharon.
When we start to look at the Moravian Church, we have to look at James Young Edgell. In 1765 is when the Moravians came to Barbados. They came to the region around 1732, and they went to the U.S. Virgin Islands from Bohemia, Czechoslovakia, and there's still a great presence of the Moravian in the U.S. Virgin Islands. But to Barbados in particular, in 1765.
Two missionaries were sent here to Barbados, and their names, John Wood and Andrew Richmond Berger. They came via London, and they arrived on the 26th of September, 1765. And straight up, it wasn't easy going because the good gentleman, Mr. Richmond Berger, he died 19 days after. And his partner, John Wood, he caught fright and he abandoned the work. And when news was received then that he had died, that is that Richmond Berger had died, the mission board called two others to the work here. And interesting enough, that fellow died within a week of having arrived in 1766. So it wasn't until 1767 then that Benjamin Brookshaw came from England to continue the work, and things began to look up, and he prevailed.
That's when they went to Bunkers Hill, and we called Bunkers Hill Old Sharon. That is where the first sanctuary was. It wasn't what we say was a substantial property then. It is this site that was the substantial property that came in 1799. But the early Sharon started in Bunkers Hill, and they would make their way to Bunkers Hill and hold services there.
The plot of land there, they say about 2 acres, on which there was a partially demolished house, by fire, and then they were able to repair that house and to establish a mission base there. So on Christmas Eve, 1767, it was that they dedicated the place and named it Bunkers Hill.
The Moravians, when they first came to Barbados, they were given help by a Mr. Jackman, and I believe that he was connected to the Jackman plantation, which is not very far away from this actual spot.
Mr. Jackman, who was a Quaker, by the way, gave place to a missionary, and so allowed him to preach to his slaves and to hold services. And apparently there were some, put simply, white folks who also attended these services.
So, and he was they were charitable towards the Moravians, and I would say the preaching or the teachings of the Moravian church kind of controlled the population, so that when they were uprisings, the Moravians at the time did not get involved to that extent. Now, with hindsight, we can be judgmental and we can say they did not participate in the freedom of the blacks and so on, but with hindsight, we can make all sorts of judgments. But the teachings of the Moravian church at the time somehow had a controlling effect on the persons who they had access to and who they preached to on the plantation, which kind of controlled them. So, and they, I guess there would have been other examples of this, because the Moravians not only remained in this area, they went to St. John, St. Joseph, and wherever they went, they carried the school. Just as the Anglican Church, you have the what we call chapels of ease, as in the case of Holy Innocents, which was every parish had a parish church, Anglican church. But everybody could not get to that church, that parish church. So they had chapels of ease. And while this might be a Moravian-oriented program, the Bishop William Hart Coleridge, he spent some time in education and looking at establishing chapels of ease. And associated with all of these chapels would have been a school. So if you establish a church, then you had a school attached to it. So, and then the Bishop Coleridge came in 1825, 1825 to 1842. So he would have been here in 1838 when there was emancipation. So once there was emancipation, this meant that a whole set of children would have been released. What are you going to do with these children? So he established schools so that you can educate the children and be able to pass on information which would be useful to them, which would be able to engage them in useful activity prior to leaving school. Although it would have been principally agrarian activity which they would have been involved in. However, there still were some skills like mechanics and men to work in the factories and so on, and craftsmen. You still had some other jobs, and these would have been a higher social economic bracket, and they would have occupied a more privileged position in society, and consequently their children and so on. And it is one thing that blacks understood was the importance of education and the ownership of land. Education and the ownership of land, which would improve their socio-economic position. Because take, for example, Bridgefield would have been a free village, Rock Hall and Bridgefield, because I hear Rock Hall being touted as the freedom village, but they do not mention that Rock Hall and Bridgefield, because some of the same Mount Wilton persons who bought Rock Hall, some bought Rock Hall and some bought land at Bridgefield. 12.5 acres was cut from Rugby or Social Hall, and that land was bought by persons who were legatees from Mount Wilton Plantation, and they were able to go to an existence outside of the plantation. Because when you own land, you could work the land and sell the produce, and that will give you a kind of independence from relying on the plantation. Because, you know, the Professor Beckles used to say that we always had a kind of constructive engagement with the plantation, we were never cut off. Slavery came to an end and so on and so on, but where did you work? You had no choice. In Guyana, where you had land, a person could go on crown land. In the islands that were big and you had crown land, you would go on the crown land. But those in Barbados, every piece of the land was taken out. So it was only those who were able to either purchase the freedom or purchase property, however they got it, were able to lead an existence independent of the plantation. And that is how they were able to get some social mobility and were able to talk back to some people of a different color. In my view, James Young Edgehill, his role in education in Barbados and in the Moravian Church in particular was monumental to the extent that he was involved in the Mitchington Commission and so on. So it was James Young Edgehill who started the ragged schools in the post-cholera era, because you had a lot of children, poor children, running around in the city and, well, I would say uncared for. Parents had died and so on, and they roamed the streets, eking out an existence however they could. James Young saw this, and he said, look, we need to do something about this, because these children represent the future. We can't let them continue in this condition. So he established the ragged schools that you actually lived there, like boarding schools. Other people had established ragged schools in other parts of the world, but in Barbados, Edgehill established the ragged schools. In discussing these schools with Lester Vaughan, who was well known, the school that is named after him is just a short distance away. He said that these schools were schools which, in his view, were built, and we had people who were ambitious for their children. So they established these schools, and they continued well into the early 20th century, because ragged schools had been dotted around Barbados. But this was in addition to the regular schools. Now, let's get back to James Young Edgehill, because, as I said, he was the first Moravian minister of European extraction to be ordained in Antigua, and he was a Barbadian of Barbadian descent. Yes, James Young Edgehill, when he was ordained in 1853, and he was involved with the Sharon Moravian, and on his way up from the city, because he lived in the city next to Coleridge Street, next to the Central Police Station, on his way up to Sharon, he established a school called Buxton. Now, in those days, the schools would have been serving a dual purpose. It was not only a school during the day, but it was a meeting place in the evenings and on the weekend. So it was a school and a church. So on his way up to Sharon, there was this meeting house where he said that they used to keep these quote-unquote brahms or fects. And one Tuesday evening, he went in while they were at the height of their revelry and held a prayer meeting. And he established prayer meetings at that spot and established a church, a school, and it was given the name of Buxton, named after Thomas Fowell Buxton, who would have been an abolitionist. And the owners eventually of the Lodge plantation, gave the land, and the money given by the Buxton family was able to build a substantial building where we now see the Buxton building. Now, in recent times, we know it as Piano Man, but it was a school, it was a church, and it was some significant people. I remember there was a chap on the call-in program, Mr. Submission. He was one of the guys who went to school at Buxton, and he was very proud of his association with Buxton. And William S. Arthur, who was a poet and so on, was the head teacher at Buxton for some time. This church, there was the Reverend D.C. Moore. He was a head teacher at Buxton as well. Duncan Carlisle Moore, he was the head teacher at Buxton. But then he resigned to come into the ministry full time. Yeah. And he was the minister here for quite some years. I heard a king who was on your program talking about Buxton School and his experiences and the head teachers and so on. So Buxton would have played a pivotal role in the lives of the children and the people generally of that area.
So I attended then class 4 at Buxton Boys School, one of the other Moravian schools. Yeah, so I attended Sharon here from Infants A to mid-class 3, and then I went to Buxton on Green Hill. It was a mixed school, meaning boys and girls here at Sharon, but the fourth form was boys' school at Buxton. That was a little different stuff. Yeah, I enjoyed it there as well.
This area, Green Hill, Jackson, Sharp Hill, even as far as Puri Spring, the Moravian Church had a significant influence in this area. In the Puri Spring area, we have Dunscombe, and that was a school there as well. So there was a school and a church at Dunscombe. There was one, as I said earlier, when we were discussing it, at Sharp Hill, where the Moravians had, after they had spent 100 years here, they came in 1765. So in 1865, the government gave them a donation. Said, look, we recognize your work in Barbados, and they gave them this donation, and they built the church or property at Sharp Hill, which they call Centenary. That's the reason for the name, Centenary. 100 years after, 1765, 1865, and it was a school and a church. So from there, we have Sharon, we have Dunscombe, we have Buxton, and Montgomery as well. Now, Montgomery was established around the 1850s as well. I think 1854, 55, somewhere in there. And that was established by the Moravian Church. And one of the persons who was involved there was in Montgomery, who was the father of the great hymn writer. But he was the father of the hymn writer, and they named the school Montgomery. Now, and it was established in the area which they call the Black Rock area. Now, the Montgomery was established, and there was Montgomery Boys, and they established Montgomery Girls. Now, Montgomery Girls got a name change when James Young Edgell died in around he died in 1897. So by 1899, the name was changed in recognition of his work in education and in the church, the Moravian Church of Barbados. So Edgell was a seminal figure in Barbados in his time. And in my view, he should be part of a, if not a national hero, at least part of a pantheon of national heroes who would have contributed immensely to work in Barbados, the work of the church, and especially because he was ordained in 1853. By 1854, you had the cholera epidemic, and he actually had to administer medicines to those cholera sufferers, and I guess bury some of the cholera sufferers as well. Now, right in front of the church, that open area, that is the cholera ground. Nothing can be built there. That is the area where the persons who suffered from cholera had to be buried so quickly. They were buried there. At Holy Innocents as well, I remember the area which we played was the pasture, was the cholera ground. To this day, it is still vacant, it is overrun with bush, but you can't build anything on it because it was the cholera ground. Well, they built a playing field in the area behind the church. Not the church, but behind the burial ground on the above side of the church, on the east and western. But they built the playing field on that side, not interfering with the cholera ground. So the James Young Edgell would have been a seminal figure in his time, working to, I want to say, advance education and to advance the church, the Moravian church in Barbados. Because he did not have to. He chose to get involved. And James Young Edgell, he had a newspaper, and he sold it to Henry Fraser's great-great-grandfather. So this Henry Fraser bought the newspaper, James Young Edgell. Yeah.
You know what the name of that newspaper?
I think it was the West Indian. I think it was the West Indian. So Edgell was into journalism before he went into the ministry. He was a court reporter, journalist, and so on, before he decided to forego all that and concentrate on the ministry. So he had a stint in Guyana and so on. So his bio was interesting. He was buried in Barbados at St. Michael's Cathedral with his first wife, because she had died, and then he married a McCaskey, I think it was it. But he got married again, and this was a woman of color. Yeah. But when he died, he went into the grave of his first wife, James Young Edgell.
Quite interesting. Hal Eiffel returns to Bunker Hill and, in a sense, he laments what occurred there when a number of the tombstones were bulldozed.
It's critical that they do something at Bunkers Hill. It is part of the history, and when you read what was done, to me it's a desecration of the place.
The Moravian Church, which has a long history in Barbados, has filed an injunction in the High Court to prevent any further destruction of the tombs of the early Moravian missionaries. This was revealed at a media conference this morning. Rosemary Allen was there and files this report.
The tombs of the early Moravian missionaries at Bunkers Hill, located at Grandview in St. Thomas, were demolished by earth-moving equipment last Saturday. Supervisor of the Moravian Church, the Reverend Vera Weiss, says the destruction of the tombs, which have been in existence since 1765, was one of the saddest moments in the history of the Moravian Church in the Caribbean.
The destruction came 2 days before a very important Moravian anniversary. The celebration of the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on August 13th, which we as Moravians believe was the initial driving force that inspired and propelled Moravians to be the first missionaries to the slaves in this part of the world.
George Ramsey, a member of the church council, says that what makes the event so tragic was the fact that the church had big plans to develop Bunkers Hill as a heritage site.
It was agreed that the area be developed as the heritage site. It was also decided that we would begin heritage tours and Bunkers Hill would be the focal point of the tours. The tours would include hotel guests, passengers on cruise lines, local as well as visiting Moravians and Barbadians generally.
Historian Dr. Carl Watson explained that the destruction of the tombs demonstrates a lack of respect for and an understanding of history by Barbadians, and a call for stronger legislation to deal with the destruction of monuments and heritage sites.
I think that unless government puts some teeth in the legislation, then this incident will repeat itself over and over. And again, to underscore what the Trust feels about it, the Trust abhors the incident. The Trust would like, hopefully, sometime in the future, to see those tombstones, to see the wall built around the tombstones, and to see the dream of the Moravian Church come true.
People who came from Czechoslovakia to this region and made the effort to Christianize and educate, because the education of blacks revolved around the Moravian Church. When the Moravians came, they came to the slaves, and they were able to educate. And one of the early persons who got involved in education was a Joseph Carrington from here, who was an inspector of schools. And James Young, I just recognized that he's the old Sharon boy, that he is now an inspector of schools. Can you imagine? And that was in the days when all the significant people in all the significant positions in government came from outside. The Commissioner of Police and the Governor General and all the civil service, all the colonial secretary, all those major positions were held by white people. But then, because of education, they couldn't keep out the blacks, because there were clearly some blacks who were head and shoulders above the others. So they had to include them. So the Joseph Carrington, I think Joseph Carrington, he was one of the early inspectors of schools, and he was appointed close to the early 20th century. So education was very, very important to the Moravian Church, very important to the blacks, because they understood the only way to get out of this particular situation that we are in is either through education or ownership of land. So when the opportunity came for them to leave Barbados, to go outside of Barbados to seek their fortune and to come back, they went and they came back and they were able to purchase land and to improve the condition.
This has been My Community, Sharon St. Thomas, providing a better understanding of the contribution of the early Moravians who settled in Barbados. My Community, Sharon, A Flower in the Field, continues next week at the same time. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. Thanks for your time.